Hey, friends. In the previous video, I shared something that God had been teaching me about, creating or carrying pressure that He never asked us to carry. And after I posted that video, I realized that there was another lesson underneath it. And the pressure wasn't really the problem. I think the pressure came from believing that God needed or wanted a version of us that didn't exist. You know, and something else that I've been thinking about or working through or the Lord's been teaching me um, is more of a question. Have you ever noticed that we don't always bring our whole selves to God? I don't know about you, but it's like I always try to bring the respectful version, the more polished version, the version you see in church, the version that tells everybody around you that you're okay. And we tend to hold back our fear and our anxiety and our doubts, our disappointments, because I think subconsciously or deep down we believe that that disqualifies us from talking to God or being a part of that community. And the more I think about it and continue to think about it, I'm beginning to realize that if we do that with God, we probably do it with people too, because we spend so much time trying to be who we think everybody around us wants us to be. And after a while, when we do that, we slowly forget who we really are. And then I started reading through Psalms, or I think about all those times that David was crying out to God. He doesn't sound like someone who's trying to impress God. He sounds like somebody who's just trying to have a conversation with his father. There's moments where he says, "I'm afraid. My enemies are all around me." He cries out, "How long, O Lord?" And then there are moments where, I don't know about you, but I've wrestled with where God feels really far away or he feels distant. But the thing about David is he wasn't pretending. He wasn't trying to sound polished or more spiritual. He was just being honest. He was showing humility. And what's amazing, at least to me, is God didn't reject David because of his honesty or his failures or his doubt. In fact, David is remembered as a man after God's heart. And that tells me something. Maybe what draws us closer to God isn't pretending we're strong. Maybe what draws us closer is us trusting him enough to tell him when we're not okay, when we're not strong. And that got me thinking, why do we do that? Why do we hold parts of ourselves back from the one person who already knows everything about us? But I think, for me, at least sometimes it's because we've convinced ourselves that if we're anxious or uncertain or struggling, that shows God that we don't trust him enough. So instead of bringing those things to him, we try to overcome them ourselves first. We tell ourselves, once I get through this, or once I stop struggling, once I have stronger faith, then I'll come to God, because at that point I'll be ready. But what if we have it backwards? What if we've believed that for so long that we have to have our lives together before we come to God? That it's been holding us back. Because when we read scripture, that's never been his invitation. God has always invited us to come as we are, so he could help them become who he's creating them to be. And that's when the realization hit. The moments where God feels the furthest away, it's not because he's moved away from me. I think there are moments where we have convinced ourselves that we need to figure everything out before we come to him. And that's exhausting. And I think that's why Jesus' invitation was always so simple. And why I always reference it. He never said, "Come to me once you have your life figured out, once you have it all together." He just says, "Come to me." So maybe today, instead of asking ourselves how we can become someone God can use, we ask a different question. What parts of ourselves have we been hiding from Him? Because He already knows what they are. We've convinced ourselves that those parts somehow make us less worthy of His love. But here's the beautiful thing about the gospel. Jesus always met people where they were. He never waited for people to get their lives together, to figure everything out. He met people in their fear, in the midst of their doubts and depression and shame and failures, and still loved them enough to lead them somewhere new. So maybe we don't need the perfect prayer. Maybe we don't need to be polished. Maybe we don't have to have the better words. Maybe we just try being honest. So maybe our prayer is, God, here we are. You already know what we're carrying. You already know what we're afraid of. You already know where we're struggling. And instead of hiding those things, we're placing them in your hands. Because I've been learning something lately. That maybe I've spent so much time trying to be someone God can love that I've forgotten He's loved me way long before I ever started pretending. And that's true for you too. You don't have to become somebody that's worthy of God's love because, I've learned none of us are really worthy, but He loves us anyway. So we can stop pretending. So instead of trying to become somebody else, just be yourself and come to God how you are, where you are. Because I have a feeling that is who He's been waiting for this entire time. He's been waiting for the real you, the one who's not trying to become somebody that's good enough to come to God. He's just waiting for you. All right, friends. Thank you for taking some time to sit with me today, to reflect on this. And, if anything, if you're hiding behind any insecurities or inadequacies or fear or shame or anxiety, God already knows. So just bring it to Him. All right, friends. God bless.